Okay, so, we're diving into Tim Keller's Cities and Salt today.
Yeah.
And you've given us some really interesting stuff to dig into here.
Right.
Basically how Christians,
Yeah.
engage with the world around them, how their
Yeah.
faith plays out sort of
Yeah.
in the public square and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to try to do is, give you a clear path through Keller's main ideas here without getting, too bogged down in the theological weeds.
Mm-hmm.
Keller himself points out there are all these different ways that Christians approach this question, right? Of how to live out your faith in a increasingly secular world.
That's right.
So we want to make sense of that whole landscape for you.
Yeah.
And help you figure out where you might land.
Right. So I think what's really interesting about Keller's perspective is he's trying to kind of bring together different perspectives, right? And not sort of say, this is the right way,
right?
But actually say, these are all different strengths. Mm-hmm. Here are some potential pitfalls.
Right.
Let's try to look at the big picture.
Yeah.
And he does a great job of that, I think.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Okay.
One of the foundational things Keller talks about is this idea of the richness and sharpness of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of starts by describing this, pretty common way of understanding the gospel. Something like Jesus died for your sins so you could have a personal relationship with him.
Right.
What does he make of that?
I mean, he definitely affirms that.
Right.
Right. Like the importance of that personal relationship with Jesus and, the individual salvation. Mm-hmm. But he points out this critique that's often leveled at that, right? Yeah. That it can be very individualistic. Yeah. It could be sort of focused on escaping the world, almost like just get your ticket punched and go to heaven.
Right. It can be kind of this, like fire insurance kind of mentality, right? Yeah. And then he contrasts that with, a more contemporary emphasis that you see in some Christian circles on Jesus is Lord, the kingdom is at hand, right? Where you see Jesus' death as this cosmic victory over evil and, this call to work for justice and peace in the world. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, that really expands things, right?
Yeah.
And focuses on...
It's a much broader view.
Right.
It's not just about you and your relationship with Jesus. It's about how Jesus is Lord over every area of life. Yeah. And how we're called to kind of... participate in bringing about this kingdom.
Absolutely.
But Keller has a word of caution here, right?
Yes, he does.
He says, if we're not careful, this focus on the kingdom can actually turn into a new kind of legalism.
That's right.
Where we start to think it's our efforts that are building the kingdom, not God's grace. So
it's a subtle shift, but a really important one.
Right.
Where we start to focus on what we're doing instead of what Christ has done.
Exactly. So how do we hold these two things together?
Yeah. So he argues that we need to embrace both the sharpness and the richness of the gospel.
Right.
The sharpness is that core message, right? Atonement, justification, grace, things that lead to individual transformation.
Yeah.
But it's precisely that sharpness, he says, that makes the gospel so rich, so applicable to all areas of life. Right. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. You have this deeply personal, life-changing power of the gospel. Right. But that's what equips believers to then go out and engage in evangelism and the renewal of culture.
So for me, that takeaway is, you got to have that strong root system before you can see the, the healthy growth above ground.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then he moves on to these metaphors of salt and light.
Right.
So let's start with light.
Okay.
He uses this image from Matthew 5 of, Christians as a city on a hill.
Right.
So what is that picture telling us?
Well, I think the city's really important here. Right. Because it's this idea of community, right? It's not just about individual Christians living kind of decent private lives. Right. It's about them being a visible alternative community within the larger society. Right. Showing a different way of doing relationships, of doing finances, of doing power, shaped by the values of the gospel.
Okay, so this city on a hill, it's not just about individual goodness.
It's about a collective witness.
Right. It's about a different way of being together.
Absolutely.
And he says that the good deeds that are associated with this light often involve compassion and practical service.
That's right.
And he draws a connection here to the early church. Yeah.
Right. And he talks about how, early Christian leaders were known for their care for the poor and the marginalized in the Roman Empire.
Right.
How, that dedication to serving others, even as a minority, gave them a real moral authority and influence in that culture.
I mean, it's fascinating to think about how a relatively small group of people at that time could have such a profound impact.
Yeah, and Keller's point is, if we don't see that same commitment to the margins today, maybe we shouldn't expect that same kind of cultural impact.
Yeah, he even brings in this kind of surprising Old Testament reference.
Yeah, he does.
Right? He talks about how Israel was told to seek the peace and prosperity of Babylon.
So
what's the connection there?
He's emphasizing this idea that Christians should be invested in the well-being of their communities, regardless of people's beliefs. Just as Israel was called to be a blessing, even in a pagan city. So Christians are called to be good citizens in their own cities and towns.
Okay, so light is about community and actively shining through service and compassion.
Yeah.
Now let's turn to salt.
Okay.
This metaphor, he says, has a bit more of a subtle promise. It's focused on preventing decay rather than this, big visible transformation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, think about salt. Before refrigeration.
Right.
Salt was a preservative.
Yeah.
It kept things from going bad.
Yeah.
So salt of the earth suggests that Christians are playing a role in holding back moral and cultural decline.
Okay.
But he's not suggesting that we're going to completely overhaul society through this influence.
It's more of a subtle,
right,
pervasive thing. Yeah. And he also mentions the negative side of salt.
Yeah.
Right? It can be painful.
Oh, yeah.
Like putting salt on a wound.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that telling us?
Well, it highlights the fact that, you know, standing up for the truth, for what you believe is right and good, can lead to opposition. It's not always comfortable or popular to be the salt. In a decaying situation, it can create friction.
But for salt to be effective, it has to spread and penetrate.
That's right.
It can't just stay in one lump.
It's got to get in there.
Right.
So Christians need to influence culture in two ways.
Okay.
One, as a distinct countercultural community, right? The light showing a different way.
Yeah.
But two, as individuals who are spread throughout society, taking their Christian perspective and values into their workplaces, their neighborhoods, their spheres of influence.
So this is where it gets really practical, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just about what you do on Sunday or, you know, in your small group.
It's about how you live every day.
It's about bringing your faith to bear in all these different areas.
That's right.
And this leads him to this idea of faithful presence, which is a term from James Hunter.
Yeah.
So what is faithful presence?
Well, faithful presence is finding that sweet spot between withdrawing from culture completely or trying to dominate it or redeem it in some forceful way. It's about being actively engaged, faithfully present, living out your faith authentically.
But not being either isolated or triumphalistic. It's kind of this constant engagement.
It is.
Right? So the salt metaphor suggests the subtle influence to renew culture.
Right.
The light metaphor is more about the church being distinct and attractive.
Yeah.
But neither of them imply this Christian takeover of society.
That's right.
It's about influence.
It's about offering a different way.
Yeah.
Not about seizing control.
Yeah. Okay, so this leads us to the role of the church itself.
Right.
And Keller makes a distinction between what he calls the institutional church and the organic church.
Yeah, this is so helpful, I think.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit?
So the institutional church is what we usually think of, right?
Right.
When we think of church.
Right, the building,
the pastors, the programs,
or the services,
the formal structures.
Right, all that.
Yeah. The organic church is all the individual Christians who have been discipled and equipped by the institutional church and are living out their faith in all these different areas of life.
So it's the people.
Yeah, it's the scattered church.
Right, the dispersed church. So the primary job of the institutional church is evangelism and discipleship. Making disciples.
Equipping people.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the institution's job to directly run every kind of good activity in the world.
That's right.
Even if those activities are valuable.
That's exactly it.
Right.
He gives this example of people in the film industry.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the church should be discipling its members who are filmmakers, helping them think Christianly about their art. But the church doesn't need to go and start a film company. Yeah. That's the role of those individuals living out their faith. So this distinction is helpful, I think. Yeah, it's crucial, I think, for resolving this tension between evangelism and social action. Yeah. Because the institutional church focuses on its core mission. Right. But the calling of all Christians is to resist and heal the effects of sin. Right. And that can take all kinds of forms. Yeah. So this could involve anything from, it could be evangelism. It could be, counseling. It could be sheltering, feeding, caring for the sick, working to create.
A more just society.
So there's a huge range.
Yeah, it's a huge range of ways that we can live out that calling.
Okay. And a crucial way that the institutional church equips the organic church is through how it shapes people's understanding of their work, their vocation.
Yeah, this is huge.
Yeah, he talks about 4 ways that faith should inform our work. So let's kind of walk through those. Okay. The first is motivation.
Right. So for professionals who might be tempted to find their identity in their career success. Yeah. The gospel provides a different foundation. Right. It frees them from, the need for that constant validation. Yeah. And then for people in, more manual or service-oriented jobs, it shifts the perspective from just doing the bare minimum. Right. From iServe.
Yeah, doing just enough to not get fired.
Right. Yeah.
To working
as unto the Lord.
Right.
Colossians 3.
Yeah. So your motivation.
So your whole reason.
Is so different working.
Changes.
Yeah.
Second. Faith shapes our work through our conception of it.
Yeah. What do we think work is?
Yeah. What do we even think work is?
Right. And this is about, having a theology of creation. Okay. That values all kinds of work that serve God and build up community.
Right. So he's pushing back.
And he's pushing back against this idea that only difficult or high status work is valuable. He says, making a shoe.
Filling a tooth, digging a ditch. Right. These are all ways of rearranging the material world for good. Yeah. Even things like cultural production.
Right. Making music.
Yeah, art.
Yeah, writing books. All of that.
All of that is part of this creative work.
Third, faith provides a high ethical framework for our work. Yeah. So it's not just about following the letter of the law.
It's about operating with integrity, justice, honesty, compassion, which often sets a higher standard than it's merely legal.
Exactly. And finally, faith allows us to kind of reconceive the nature of our work.
Right. And to identify.
Yeah, to see the sin, the brokenness that might be embedded in our fields.
So, for example, somebody in the medical field might question profit-driven practices that don't actually benefit patients. Somebody in advertising might challenge manipulative marketing tactics. A business owner might discern and work against unfair labor practices.
So it's about bringing that Christian worldview to bear.
It is on how we see the problems in our own field.
Yeah, and actually working to change them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then Keller makes this really strong case for the importance of cities. So why Why this specific focus on urban centers?
Well, historically, cities have always been centers of culture and influence. He points out that, going back centuries, urban areas often had a stronger Christian presence than rural areas. And new ideas tend to emerge in cities and then spread outward.
Yeah. So as the city goes, so goes the culture.
Yeah, and that's his argument.
Right. But he's not saying that every Christian...
He's not saying that everybody needs to pack up and move to a big city.
Yeah, he's saying that we need...
He's saying we need faithful Christians and vibrant churches everywhere.
Everywhere. But he does highlight...
a concerning trend, which is that in many key urban centers, there's a weaker Christian presence than in less urbanized areas. And he also points to the work of missiologists who study church growth and outreach. And they're finding that even in parts of the world where Christianity is growing rapidly, it's still really hard to reach people in these secular urban environments.
So it takes more than just...
Right. It takes more than just a few churches scattered around.
Yeah, he talks about
a gospel movement.
Right.
So what does that look like?
Yeah, what is that?
Well, a gospel movement is this kind of organic, interconnected web of churches and ministries that's growing without being centrally controlled.
Yeah.
And he says at the heart of this ecosystem is the multiplication of new churches that embody these values we've been talking about.
So what are some of the other elements of this ecosystem?
Yeah, so he talks about strong Christian schools, theological schools, for-profit businesses that are run with Christian ethics, diverse nonprofit ministries